Hey everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be wrapping up every single one of the books that I read in August. August was a really strange reading month for me. I hit a massive reading slump around the middle of the month, but somehow I managed to kind of compensate for that at the start and the end of the month. I feel like I kind of know why I was in a reading slump as well, but we will get to that in due course. I want to kick things off by talking about some non-fiction books. The first book I'm going to talk about I actually read in July, but for some reason I think I didn't log it on my Goodreads, so I forgot to mention it in my wrap-up, and that is Nasty Women, which is published by 404 Inc. So this is a collection of essays with a bunch of different contributors about intolerance and inequality, and it was written in response to the most recent American presidential election. And a lot of what is spoken about in the collection of essays deals with things surrounding that. This is quite an intersectional collection of feminist essays. We have women of colour, we have queer women, all talking about their different life experiences and circumstances, and some of the essays in this collection are really rather shocking. I don't think there was anything in this that made me stop and think about things in a different way, or anything that changed my opinion. I was very much on the same side as this book. Not only is there a focus on American politics, but there is also a UK focus. A lot of the writers are writing from a Scottish perspective, and there is a lot of discussion around Brexit. I thought this was a really strong essay collection, and I would definitely recommend that you read it regardless of your familiarity with some of the subject matters, regardless of how much you've read about feminism or inequality in the past. I found it really, really accessible, and while it didn't change my opinion on anything because I was agreeing with it, I think it was definitely important that I continued to read about women who have had different life experiences to me. So I read that one back in July. Onto the books that I read in August. I read another quite similar non-fiction book, and that is Bitch Doctrine by Laurie Penny. This is also a feminist collection of essays. It also deals with the shock of Donald Trump's presidency, the rise of far-right politics, online harassment. Laurie talks about her own gender identity and sexuality, and while she does deal with large political topics, she also looks at the kind of small political moments that you don't always think about as being political in your day-to-day life. So she discusses things like women shaving their legs. There was a really interesting essay on sex work, which completely made me think about things in such a different way. I have always been very much pro the regulation of sex work, making it legal, and therefore making it as safe as possible for sex workers who have the freedom to choose that they work in the sex industry. But Laurie got me thinking about whether you actually can consent to being a sex worker, because how much are we actually consenting when it comes to work? Would you work if you didn't have to? Is work in its very existence non-consensual? So can you be a consensual sex worker? How would the regulation of sex work function in our society? Would you have to consider becoming a sex worker in order to claim like unemployment benefit? So yeah, Laurie just gave me a lot of food for thought with this collection of essays, and I would highly recommend it. And the final non-fiction book I have to talk about is Victorians Undone by Catherine Hughes. This one was a bit of a mixed bag for me. I really enjoyed parts of it, and a lot of it I also found quite boring. So this is a non-fiction book all about bodies in the Victorian era. Actual reference to bodily function is not something that we hear about when we are educated about the Victorian period, and a lot of what I learned from this book was really fascinating. Learning about the history of beards was definitely an interesting one, and why men decided to either grow or abandon their facial hair. I didn't find it massively interesting learning about Queen Victoria herself, but in contrast I really enjoyed learning more about George Eliot. I also found the story of Fanny Adams terribly tragic and also very fascinating. I found at times the author repeated herself quite a lot, and large chunks of this could be cut out and we would still understand what she was trying to say and the information that she was trying to reveal to us. So I didn't think this was fantastically written. I think there were a lot of things that could have been edited out of it or maybe written in a stronger way. But regardless, I thought this was a really valuable book. I learned a lot from it. If you are interested in writing about the Victorian period, then I think it would be a really valuable source for you to learn So it's about kind of the everyday things that Victorians dealt with and how they navigated their lives. So yeah, that is all the non-fiction that I'm going to talk about today. I read one poetry collection, and that was Plum by Holly McNish. I wasn't sure exactly what to expect from this collection in terms of theme or anything like that, but I was sure I was going to love it because I think Holly is a fantastic poet. One of the really interesting things that she does in this collection is that she sort of curates poetry from her past. So she includes poetry that she wrote as a child or as a teenager and responds to it, which I thought was really interesting. I'm sure I'm going to look back on some of my own poetry one day and just be like, how the hell did I think this was good? But actually what's really annoying is that a lot of her poetry from when she was young is really, really good. You see Holly thinking about her first experiences in numerous different areas, but also how her opinions on those things have developed and how she's made more in-depth observations than she had done in the past. And of course the poetry is just fantastic. It is the kind of poetry that you read and then wish that you had written. There's one poem in particular, I think it might be called Polite, but it's about blowjobs, and I think it's brilliant, utterly fantastic. It's the standout poem from the collection for me. It's only about 80 or 90 pages or so I would highly recommend that you give this one a read. I also read a YA book this month that was written in verse, and that was This Impossible Light by Lily Myers. And while I found the reading experience of this quite easy, it's not a book that has really stayed with me. So this is about a young girl named Ivy whose life is in a lot of turmoil. Her parents have split up and her mother is not coping very well. Her best friend has become distant. Her brother has moved off to college. And as well as this, Ivy is also struggling with her body image and developing an eating disorder. All very important topics to read about, so I would definitely recommend it in that regard. However, as I said, it's not really a book that stayed with me massively, and I think that is due to the format of it. As I said, it is written in verse, so we have very little description. You know, when we have novels written in verse, it's not really the same as poetry where you are getting the maximum amount of content from the minimum amount of words. And while it contributed to a sort of stream of consciousness style, I do think the verse format prevented me from becoming fully engaged with the character and remembering the story well. I don't think this is something that you can blame necessarily on the form, but of how the author used the form. I've seen this done really, really well in books like Sarah Crossan's One, where the format did nothing but complement the story. There just wasn't enough depth to this book for me to be satisfied with the storytelling, but also its engagement with its difficult subject matters. I did really appreciate seeing a sibling relationship that was really strong. That's something that I will definitely praise this book for. I'm unsure exactly what category to put this next one in, whether to say it's a children's book or a young adult book, but I thoroughly enjoyed it and found it a fantastic read, and that was My Sister Lives on the Mantelpiece by Annabelle Pitcher. I had read one of Annabelle Pitcher's other novels, Ketchup Clouds, a couple of years ago, and I thought that was really good as well, but this one absolutely surpassed my expectations. It was a brilliant book. So this is about a 10-year-old boy named Jamie and how his life is affected by grief. Jamie is the youngest of 3 children. He had 2 older sisters. One is still alive, but the other was tragically killed in a terrorist bomb attack in London. This happened when Jamie was very young and he has no recollection of. He has always known that one of his older sisters lived on the mantelpiece. Jamie's parents split up and he's also dealing with that. His father isn't coping at all and becomes incredibly negligent. The children's mother has also moved in with a new man. We've kind of forgotten about her kids. Jamie's older sister is also dealing with her own struggles. You know, she has lost her sister as well, but she also has this feeling that she will never have her own individuality, and you see her really rebelling against her parents' wish that she was still like her twin sister. When Jamie goes to a new school because they move away from London, he meets a young Muslim girl who he quickly becomes very strong friends with, despite his father's firm warnings that they must never associate with anyone of the Muslim faith. He has to keep this growing friendship and relationship secret from his father. Jamie manages to overcome the prejudices that his father has taught him, but Jamie's father blames Islam so strongly for the death of his daughter that this is something that he definitely struggles to overcome. I thought this was a really fascinating element to the book, and it showed that in times like this we can brand people racist because people are racist. but sometimes it's important to look a little deeper and understand why their thought processes have been warped to blaming the wrong individuals. There are a number of really touching moments in this book as well, and it's another book that has a really strong sibling relationship. Jamie's relationship with his cat is also a very touching one. I thought this book was incredibly well written. I thought the child's perspective worked really well, and it did that brilliant thing that children's literature so often does, where it gives children a chance to confront difficult issues in a safe environment. But as an adult reader, there are also moments when you're more aware of what's going on than the protagonist is. You know, you work out what is happening while they're still processing it, so you can fully focus your attention on looking at how they're processing the situation rather than working out the situation yourself. The next book I read in August was Swing Time by Zadie Smith, and this was my first Zadie Smith novel. I thought it was a pretty strong one, but I didn't think it was absolutely amazing. This book has a lot to do with race, it has a lot to do with heritage. We begin with two young girls of colour, who are best friends, and they both dream of being dancers. I don't think this book is necessarily about where we begin, but that is where we begin. It's more about the journey that we go on with these characters, where they end up, and how we see circumstances beyond their control affecting how their lives progress. I feel like Zadie Smith was juggling so many balls with this novel. There were elements that I found really interesting, but I don't think we ever got to delve into them enough. I was really interested in our main character's mother. I thought her story was really interesting, and while we get glimpses into it, I would have liked more. I also would have liked to know more about the best friend character. And in many ways, I found the protagonist of this novel the least interesting character that there was. She was more of a vehicle for all these other stories to be told through. And there's not something inherently wrong with that, but I don't think it worked as well as it could have in this novel. I just felt there was a lack of focus with this book. I think that's a real shame because it had huge potential to be great for me. I felt it was just a little bit scrambled. There were too many different things going on. This one is on the Man Booker long list, so I'd be really interested to see how far it makes it. To be perfectly honest with you, I don't think I'd be surprised if it didn't make the shortlist, but having said that, this is only my third book off the long list, so I'm not sure how all of the others compare. In August, I also took part in the 4th round of Tome Topple, and I read 2 books for this, the first of which was The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee. I'd heard a lot of good things about this YA adventure novel. This book follows a very upper-class, wealthy gentleman named Monty, or at least his father wants to force him to be a gentleman. Monty is definitely rebelling against that. Monty's father sends him on a grand tour of Europe along with his best friend Percy and his sister Felicity. There are a number of really fantastic elements to this book. Both Percy and Monty identify as bisexual, and it was really interesting to see that navigating that and understanding it in the time period, seeing people that approved and people that didn't approve. There's a will they won't they throughout the novel. Monty has a definite crush on Percy, and they share a number of moments throughout the novel that are interrupted or end up going pear-shaped. Percy is also a person of colour, and there were a number of moments where it's really interesting to witness how Monty doesn't quite understand how that makes things different for Percy. Felicity, the little sister, was also a really interesting character. At times I massively loved and supported her. She was incredibly bookish. She believed in the strength of women and she really wanted to have a fair education. But also at times she really failed to understand her brother's sexuality and said a number of problematic things. Sometimes when you read books you aren't sure if an author is being prejudiced or if their characters are being prejudiced. And in this book, it is definitely the latter. These characters are incredibly flawed, and that's what makes them so real. I wasn't massively interested in the plot of this novel. I wasn't interested in essentially any events that happened or the adventure side of it. It really did not interest me. But having that as a vehicle for some really poignant moments between such strong characters really made this a brilliant read for me. The second book that I read for Tome Topple was Mitch Albom's The Magic Strings of Frankie Presto. This is a book that has multiple different perspectives, but it is mainly narrated by music itself. It tells the story of a musician named Frankie Presto, who is an absolutely incredible musician, and his music changed the life of so many different people. While I really enjoyed the writing style of this novel, this was another book where the plot didn't really interest me that much. I also really didn't enjoy the ending of this book. If you have read this one, let me know what you thought about the ending, because I just thought it was really strange. It all seemed to be tied up too neatly, and the fantastical elements to it just didn't really sit right with me. There were parts of this book that I found quite self-indulgent as well. So yeah, I'm just not really that sure what I thought of this one. Another book that I had quite a mixed reading experience with was Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I had been reading this book for 2 months. That's a really fucking long time for me. Can't really talk about this book without revealing the plot of it, and that's kind of the problem. So this is meant to be a really scandalous story, reflective of the Victorian age, about the young, beautiful and mysterious Lady Audley. We know that Lady Audley has a secret that is set to be revealed by a seductive outsider. It's really obvious what the secret is. It is so blatantly obvious what is going on in this book. So I went into this expecting a mystery, and there was none. I think this book is the reason that I got into a reading slump. It took me so long to read it, I never wanted to go back to it. I think it's a real shame. This book had huge potential to be something that really interested me, but yeah, I was quite let down. The next book I read was How to Build a Girl by Caitlin Moran. I wanted to read this book for a really long time, which is actually kind of relevant here. I used to be obsessed with Caitlin Moran. I thought she was incredible. She was like my gateway feminist. Since my understanding of feminism and particularly intersectional feminism has expanded, I have learnt that Caitlin Moran hasn't done a number of problematic things in the past and said a number of problematic things in the past where she has been disrespectful of other minority groups. Her feminism has not always been intersectional, and that's not something I endorse. But this book had been sat on my shelf for a really long time, and I thought it was about time that I did get around to it. And as far as I can tell, none of those problematic things come through in this book. There is one moment where she should blank out an N-word. So this is a book I've wanted to read since I was a teenager, and I think my reading experience of this book would be very different had I done that. This is about a teenage girl named Joanna. She is from a working class family in Wolverhampton. Her family struggles financially, there are a lot of children involved. Joanna decides to reinvent herself as Dolly Wilde. She gets a job reviewing music and doing interviews with musicians, and we follow her through that journey. Joanna is also on a journey of sexual discovery. There's a lot of discussion of female masturbation in this book, and I thought I was alone in some of the things I did when I was a teenager, but I wasn't, and that was really nice to see in this book. It's just really nice to see a book talk openly about female sexuality and teenage sexuality. Joanna also has a very interesting pursuit of sexual encounters, and I think if I'd read this when I was a teenager, I would have thought she was really cool. Now, reading it when I'm a little bit older, I am concerned for her safety. She has sex with numerous older men. I was so worried for her. And it's such a strange dynamic that I recognise from my own life and I recognise from the lives of numerous friends. When you're a young woman, you feel like you are so in charge of your sexuality. You find it empowering. You feel like you're fully consenting to everything that's happening. But on reflection, you're really not. And you see Joanna come to those realisations in this book. It's also a really powerful depiction of what it's like to be working class in the UK and the struggles that brings. I read this in 2 sittings, which according to the back was 1 more than it took Nigella Lawson. I'm really glad that I read this book. I will always say that it is so important to read about people who are different from you, and in many ways Joanna is different from me. But in a number of ways I definitely saw elements of myself or myself from the past in her character, and I think sometimes it's important to do that as well. To read books that you are able to see yourself in. There's also another really strong sibling relationship in this book with her older brother, and I thought that was really, really awesome. The final book that I read in August was Kitchen by Banana Yoshimoto. That is translated from the Japanese by Megan Backus. This is a story about womanhood, it is about bereavement, it is about transsexuality, it is about love, and it is about tragedy in contemporary Japan. This is only the 2nd Japanese novel that I've ever read, and I saw a number of similar things going on in that the writer was able to get a huge amount of depth from an incredibly ordinary scene. I feel like you should go into this book not knowing a huge amount about the plot, but I will say that it follows a young woman coming to terms with the death of her grandmother, struggling to keep up with her university work, and her growing relationships with those around her. It also profoundly features her relationship with the kitchen. And the authors made me think about a kitchen in a way that I've never really thought about one before. But in such a, really positive way. I just feel like this is one that you need to just delve into, and you will read it in one sitting. So yeah, they are all the books that I'm going to talk about today. Do let me know down below if you've read any of these and what you thought of them. As I said, it was quite a mixed reading month, and I didn't enjoy a whole lot of what I read. Do you know, that's not necessarily true. I did enjoy a lot of what I read. The majority of what I read. There were just a few books that I had quite a poor experience with. So yeah, that's it from me for now, but I will talk to you guys in my next video.